Great. Well, let's see. There we go. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for sticking around after what was really an interesting conversation with Assistant Secretary Reeker. I want to welcome you to our next panel, which is entitled Identity, Values, and Democracy. What does the West stand for? We have a great panel to talk about what is really a critical topic at this time. It's something that, as we see sort of increasing discussion on both sides of the Atlantic of topics like where democracy ends and authoritarianism begins, where identity fits into our countries and our transatlantic relationship. This is really a critical topic and one that is under discussion in the US, in the countries of Central Europe, as well as part of the transatlantic relationship. So we have a great panel here today for what will be 30 minutes of discussion, followed by 30 minutes of questions. So I encourage all of you in the audience to start thinking about what you'd like to ask our panelists. We have on this panel Ambassador Dan Fried, who needs no introduction, but just briefly, he is a former State Department Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Ambassador to Poland, and now the just announced Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. To his left, Anna Smith-Lacey, who's the Executive Director of the Hungary Initiatives Foundation. And last but not least, Pavol Demeš, who has really been a leading figure since the Velvet Revolution on foreign policy in Central Europe. He is currently a transatlantic fellow at GMF, German Marshall Fund, as well as a board member of GLOBSEC. So with that, let's get started. Dan, I'd like to start with you and just have you set the stage for us. We hear a lot about democratic backsliding, about a move to a liberal democracy in places like Poland and Hungary. How do you evaluate the situation?
There is a lot of, frankly, lazy and simple analysis where I've seen prominent op-ed writers in the United States say that Poland and Hungary are returning to their natural authoritarian roots, which is just nonsense. It's nonsense. And we do an insult to ourselves and others if we fall into lazy traps. The fact is, throughout the West, there is a struggle going on about what the Western tradition means. And that tradition is not one thing, it's several things. It includes the nation state, which has a good side, which is patriotism, and a bad side, which is chauvinism. Patriotism, as de Gaulle said, is love of one's country. Chauvinism is hatred of everybody else. But the West is also, and in my view, principally defined by transnational universal values. And this isn't political correctness. This goes from Thomas Aquinas, right? And Immanuel Kant, and since we're in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, about the inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And for Immanuel Kant, it was on an individual level, the irreducible dignity of human beings. And in international affairs, the theory of perpetual peace between republics, which we now call, in an awful jargon, the liberal international order. This is the Western tradition, but of course there's that other tradition, which produced fascism. That wasn't an Asian import, that was us. And there's a struggle now between the good side and the bad side of the West, and everybody's going through it. I mean, look at the battle in the United States between our, let us say, our good tradition, the Declaration of Independence, and that other tradition. Okay, what? The white man's republic? Okay, so we Americans need to be modest, and we need to understand that we're all going through this. And then when we start talking about our common values, we shouldn't start lecturing, for example, the Hungarians. And I think Phil Reeker was spot on right when he said we were wagging our finger at the Hungarians and expected to get good results. Like, come on. But we should stand, our best ground to stand on is those common Western values. But the reason I've proven myself a horrible policy, a horrible wonk, as well as a terrible old man, is because Western values are often used as an incantation without being unpacked. And they need to be unpacked. What do they mean? And it's that combination of the nation and patriotism, but circumscribed by higher universal values. That's how we did so well in 1989. And the last point I'd make is that America and Central Europe do our best when we are true to our best selves. And when we forget our best selves, when the United States turns away from support for universal values and falls back to spheres of influence and cynicism, and when Central Europe forgets how they overthrew communism, which was the nation and universal values, then things don't turn out so well. But we can make this work. Anyway, the long answer to a simple question, but I've been thinking about it. We've all had to think about it and still do.
Great, thanks for that, Dan. Pavol, I'd like to go to you next. Slovakia had a pretty exciting election recently with the election of a new president who surprised a lot of people, Zuzana Čaputová. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her election, what you make of it, given that it seems to be swimming against the stream of what we've seen in Central Europe in recent years.
Thank you very much for this. But before I will answer this very Slovak-specific question, and I will do it with great pleasure, I just wanted to say that how happy I am to be here at this very time. Originally, I thought that who would come mid-July to debating Central Europe and United States. I thought that you are busy with other things, but seeing so many friends, including Dan, but also yesterday, John Allen and Mark Grossman, Paula Dobriansky, with whom and others with whom I have so many exciting memories throughout the last 30 years, that it was just good decision that I accepted Atlantic Council. Also, seeing signing ceremony between American leading think tank with Slovak think tank GLOBSEC, 30 years after fall of communism and Velvet Revolution, I think it was something for me. I would cherish it as memorable moment. I never thought 30 years ago when I came here that one day Slovak think tank would sign agreement, and we are having Slovak and American logos behind us with Dan, with whom we went through all kinds of ups and downs. So I think that this is just sort of testimony of the time. Now, coming to your question and Zuzana Čaputová, I think that her elections symbolizes something fundamental in connection with topic of our discussion, values. And values and politics, values and civil society, and also values within transatlantic space. I think that Zuzana Čaputová was elected because of some very specific circumstances and psychology within the country, which evolved after last year's murder of 27-year-old journalist and his fiancée, young brave man who was basically doing X-ray of society, and he paid price. And he unleashed largest protests within the country and rebellion against politics intertwined with business and even Italian mafia in such an extent that people said enough is enough and started protesting similar like during Velvet Revolution, and basically through civic action caused reshuffle within government and unleashed people's desire to have more justice, freedom, openness, transparency. And she won elections on seemingly useless in today's world politics because she was just clear, her integrity was intact throughout the whole process. She was talking about truth, And she also approached the young generation through social media in such an extent that they self-identified themselves with her version and vision of what politics should be all about. And Zuzana Čaputová reconnected basically her world of political engagement with vision of Václav Havel from 30 years ago. And Václav Havel's bust is in the US Congress. I think that Zuzana Čaputová just reclaimed what we believed in when we were changing the system. And since recently she visited 3 Visegrad countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Brussels, I think it's very indicative how she handled herself and basically also articulated what people somehow feel and would expect of her. In Czech Republic, she went and laid flowers on grave of Václav Havel. And among other things, she said that she believes that people have a right to protest. Because today in Czech Republic, they had over 250,000 people protesting against rather strange behavior of their government leaders. And she said she understands that people can protest. And it was almost big political statement, which is just from vocabulary of any democracy. When she went to Hungary, we were watching what she will say in that country, which developed quite different system than we used to believe in 30 years ago, when Hungary was leading democratic country in the region. And she also said that democracy, human rights, and European values, transatlantic values are the best what we have. And I think Viktor Orbán, who is a very smart politician, he didn't went on media and didn't comment on that. And she just dismissed accusation that she's agent of George Soros, which is outrageous new wave of political maneuvering within the region, because it sounded so ridiculous that she just with one sentence just smashed it. In Poland last week, she also said how she sort of appreciates solidarity movement, Lech Walesa, and last but not least, in Brussels, when she visited Secretary General of NATO or Jean-Claude Juncker, President of European Commission, she publicly said that Brussels is not abroad. It's our home, because we are members of EU and NATO. And last but not least, last week, when Chinese foreign minister visited, she just said that we are concerned that there are political oppressions and activists are oppressed and so on. She opened up huge debate whether one can say to big China that you are concerned if things are there. So all in all, I think that Zuzana Čaputová and her way to White House in Bratislava and how she handles herself both domestically and internationally is, from my point of view, breath of fresh air, not only for Slovakia but in the region, because just she is saying as things what we expected or what Václav Havel was doing. And when she was asked who is her hero, she said that Václav Havel and Mahatma Gandhi. So 30 years after in Slovakia, I think not bad that we, through her and through our broader civil society, we are opening up those fundamental discussions about what democracy and democratic politics is all about.
Thank you. And, I think it's a really important point, both that, it's a return to the values that the region embraced after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and also this idea of opening up to civil society and re-embracing those universal values. And obviously that stands in contrast to some of what we have seen in Hungary, where space for civil society has shrunk, where independent media find it difficult to operate. And I think for many of us in Washington and elsewhere, it's sometimes difficult to understand in the face of that the continuing popularity of Fidesz. And so I wonder, Anna, if you could just give us a sense from Budapest of perhaps why that is, what is the basis of that popularity and what makes Hungary different?
Thank you, and thank you, Damon, for putting together this panel because often we take it for granted that we know what we're talking about. And often we refer to liberal democracy or democracy in general, and everybody kind of assumes what we're actually talking about. And Ambassador Fried broke it down a little bit. But I think when you actually go down and dig a little deeper, you start to understand the Hungarian sentiment and why someone like Viktor Orban gets reelected 3 times, unprecedented majority in Hungary. And I think the reason why we can gloss over these definitions are twofold. One is internal and one is external. An internal reason is that there's simply just a tremendous amount of self-critical noise or outright hostile activity that are undermining the fundamental principles of the West. When you sit in Hungary and you look around Western Europe and you look at America, you think of freedom of speech and you see safe spaces. You think religious freedom, and you see anti-Semitic attacks all across Western Europe. A German official warning Jewish citizens not to wear their kippah anywhere all the time because it's a security threat. You think about the idea of integrating newcomers to society, and as opposed to that, you have parallel societies in Western Europe, tremendously untenable and unsustainable. You think of critical thinking and freedom of academic thought, yet you see disinvitations all across Western academia, and you see a narrowing of the academic space for thinkers who happen to hold unpopular opinions or who have Christian or conservative worldviews. So there's a lack of self-confidence throughout the West about what the West actually stands for on the very fundamental levels, and that really trickles over. A lack of self-confidence at best, at worst, an outright attack, a very vicious outright attack, or where the fundamental values are disregarded or dismissed. And this has a very serious destabilizing effect for the alliance. When we have such fundamental debates and such violent attacks on some of the fundamental principles, nobody really knows what we were even talking about. And it feels like the alliance or institutions that we have created hollow out and obviously lose their appeal. Especially for countries who thought, well, this is what we were aspiring towards. This is what we shed blood for in 1956. And this is no longer something that we thought actually we will be getting after the regime change. The West really cannot lose its soul and expect people to be attracted to it, and cannot expect to win geopolitical battles that way on land, on air, and sea, and on cyberspace. So it needs to find its soul, find its principles, and it's true for America, it's true for Western Europe, and honestly across our region as well, and Western Balkans too. The other factor is the external. America's geopolitical competitors, Russia and China, are pouring in massive amounts of money and resources into defining the narrative about the United States and about the West. So we have a situation where the West is defined more and more about non-Western actors, and that's just not a recipe for success. When you have China investing into Confucius Institutes all across Western Europe and all across our region as well, and America, you are guaranteed not to hear about the concentration camps of the Uyghurs. You are guaranteed not to hear the word Chinese and communist in the same sentence, and you are guaranteed to hear that the Belt and Road Initiative is the next best thing that has ever happened to Europe. Same thing with Russia and RT. If you log on to RT and follow Sputnik News, which for contrast I really encourage people to do, because it's a pretty grim picture. It's a pretty discouraging picture about what the West looks like from the outside, from the propaganda point of view. You get a pretty good selection of Donald Trump's worst tweets. You get a pretty good selection of various Antifa mobs protesting in front of ICE agents. And you get a pretty good selection of the worst of the worst face of the West. Now, why the United States is missing in action in this strategic communications warfare, and why there's no muscle put on the institutions like RFE/RL, which if you just go on Instagram has maybe 10, 15,000 followers, Sputnik News 60,000. There needs to be more resources put into the communications about what the West really is and what American values really are. So that is kind of the backdrop against which some of the Ambassador Dan Fried's comments and Phil Rieker's comments were very welcome. The new administration's approach, which was articulated in the National Security Strategy, articulated by Secretary Pompeo and President Trump at his Warsaw speech, which I think was one of the best speeches on what the West really is standing for, was a welcome change. It was a breath of fresh air because it talked about geopolitical conflict as an inherent thing in international relations, not something that we will just someday wake up and never have anymore. It talked about conflict as an inherent aspect of international relations. And in that respect, war as something that we constantly, actively want to avoid. And peace is something as the aberration in international relations and the rare thing in international relations. I come from a country where basically has 1,000 years of history. In the 13th century was overrun by the Mongol Tatars, and then for 150 years it was run over by the Ottomans, and then 200 years dominated by the Habsburgs, and then when they left, the Nazi troops moved in, and then when they left, the Soviet troops moved in for 50 years. So we know that peace is not the norm. We know and we appreciate that peace is something very rare and very precious. And Western Europe tended to have forgotten about that very real aspect of foreign policy. The other two, and I'll quickly finish here, is that international institutions that were created after World War II for a good reason, seen from Budapest, seen from Central and Eastern Europe, and seen from Warsaw in many respects as well, drifted away and sometimes far beyond their original purpose. And that's when you see some anti-EU rhetoric. That's why you see some questioning of the mandate of the OSCE, whether they have become a political institution that is playing the role of the opposition in certain countries, or whether they are doing their original mandate. So when you have national interests being channeled through international institutions, that will always be seen a legitimate source of statecraft, when it is seen as the only way of exercising your foreign policy, or the only way of exercising your defense policy or whatever else, then that will be questioned. And I think it's questioned for a good reason by the United States. The United States has, from the very beginning, from its founding era, sometimes used multilateral avenues to exercise its foreign policy, sometimes have gone unilaterally. And the crises of these institutions cannot be glossed over. It needs to be taken seriously, because otherwise the members themselves will not take it seriously. And lastly, on a third and related note, was the meaning of sovereignty that you mentioned yesterday as well as today. If we don't have a realization that international relations are done by sovereign nation states who have their sovereign interests, who have sometimes minorities, not out of their choice and out of their free will, who are stuck on the other side of the border, and that will affect their international politicking. If we don't recognize this, we will not have unity in the West. If we have respect for national sovereignty, if we do realize that it is independent nation states that are making up the West and not a borderless conglomerate of homogenous nations who are all striving for the same goal, we will not be able to tackle the real enemy, which is outside of the West. To conclude, that will have to mean more respect for the diversity of national cultures within Europe. And that needs to mean that people who are coming from different backgrounds in faith and who have different cultures and traditions need to be respected. And that's what Hungarians have felt not being respected for a period of time, and that's why you hear rhetoric that you hear from Hungary and from Poland as well. Unless we recognize this, you will not hear the West standing up with unity, with one voice against the real enemy, which I believe we all know who they are.
Thank you. I certainly agree with you on the U.S. taking a more active role and on more funding for RFE-RL. So on that, we can definitely agree. I do think, you've identified several times that who the real enemies are, Russia, China, et cetera. I mean, I would just say that I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, given that the Hungarian government has been one of the friendliest to Russia and certainly has embraced Chinese investment. So that's certainly an issue that lots of countries are struggling with, but a difficult circle to square there. I want to ask you a little bit more specifically. You talked about an attack on fundamental principles of the West, and I think a lot of people see that in some parts of Central Europe, that attack is coming at times from the government on fundamental universal principles, such as Dan outlined. And so I just wonder if you could be more specific about what those values are, briefly, because I know we're getting into our question time shortly.
There's a lot of throwing around of terms like nationalist and populist, and I think we need to take a look at what the root cause of these phenomena are. And the root cause is that people are seeking an identity. And if they feel that their identity is under attack, then they will react in ways that sometimes do not sound great. The reason why foreign fighters are recruited throughout Western Europe is not because people aged 25 and 30 want to go off and die in a land that they have never even thought about before, but because they're not getting a sense of identity if they live in certain sections in Belgium or France or Germany. They're identity seekers, and then some of the recruits are identity providers, and that identity is not something that we should tolerate. The West has better things to offer, and some of those have been outlined by Ambassador Fried, and I think that what Phil Rieker was talking about, the depth of history that this region has and the complexity of some of the issues, and he referred to Paris 1919, the outcome of the Trianon Peace Treaty. Unless you understand some of those dynamics regionally, you will not understand what the sensitivities are.
Dan, I've seen you scribbling away here. I want to give you an opportunity to respond.
I think Anna Smith-Lacey makes two important valid points. One is that the West and the Western values cannot be identified with a single political option. And when I spoke earlier of lazy analysis, it was that, to be blunt, that a center-right or conservative government is somehow less legitimate because it talks about things like national identity and language and history and seeks its political heritage in the European conservative tradition, and somehow this is regarded as inferior. Okay, so that's one important point. Another important point with which I agree is that national identity is important, and it's a good thing. It shouldn't be looked down upon. I remember once, during the Bush administration, a European Union senior and pretty smart official told me that Europe would supersede the United States because we were a mere nation and they were something superior. And I thought, oh man, you all are going to have problems. But here's, I'm going to throw not a stink bomb, but a question. Viktor Orban and other conservative leaders in Europe, not just Central Europe, talk about sovereignty and the nation and the imperative of respecting both of those. But at the same time, their national existence and security depends on transnational solidarity and an appeal to transnational values. You talked about minority issues. If Hungary is sovereign, and if sovereignty is an absolute, what then do you say to Romania? They are also sovereign. The right answer, it seems to me, is that sovereignty is limited by higher values, and those values include respect for minorities. Now, what this means in terms of language, education, road signs, national official languages, that's a complicated issue, but I'm talking about the level of values. The Western tradition has to make room for right and left options, but there are irreducible values which transcend sovereignty. Look, that's not specific, but I think President Chaputova is recalling that best tradition, that peak moment where the Czechoslovaks and Hungarians and Poles overthrew communism simultaneously in the name of national patriotism, and there were lots of conservatives, and in the name of transnational universal values, both at the same time. I mean, how did George Soros turn out to be a bad guy for the hard right? Since he believes in, the transnational universal half of that equation. But if you read John Paul II's writing, he had both. He's the Pope. He's not a liberal. But he spoke of that Western tradition without qualification. Actually, a Pope completely comfortable with the consequences of the Enlightenment, and boy, that was powerful stuff. Anyway, that's what I was actually scribbling. Again, I'm a hopeless wonk, but I look at the age range here, and so I can't help myself. This stuff is really important. Those ideas transmitted through generations drove people, and they drove the dissidents who risked their lives, honor, and sacred fortune, and were on the run for years in the name of those Western values, and they insisted that we Americans, God damn it, live up to your own ideals. And sometimes they put it just about that strongly, so it had an impact. Anyway, that Anna Smith Lacey was raising and inspired in me those observations, because what she says is, and what Pavol said, are important.
Pavol, you lived what Dan is talking about. Give us a perspective.
I think it's, for me, it's very interesting to sit with American and Hungarian on this, and I will make my second comments not on Slovakia, but on my views on this dispute about national specific, what Anna was just mentioning, unique, which is historically which has historical underpinning, and also United States. Then is speaking about patriotism, which I believe today is probably the key issue in political discourse. In the name of what we are doing things on national level and on international level. But since I'm coming from Slovakia, I know very well during 90s when Vladimír Mečiar was telling the West, you don't understand specificity of our nation. And we were excluded from negotiations process because people said, okay, if you are so unique, you are not compatible with EU and NATO, and we were done. If today Viktor Orbán is telling us that you need to understand uniqueness of Hungarians, well, EU has a lot of trouble to understand what value system Viktor Orbán is producing and its compatibility or incompatibility with overall EU. Like we do not understand Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage because they are also telling us that Britain is unique and that is why they need to leave because they can't stay with us within European Union for which they advocated and helped us to join, and now they are leaving. And for me, I am a bit confused then when Viktor Orbán comes to White House and your president is telling we are similar. Both of us are criticized, but we are doing fine within our nations because we are bringing stability and we are showing Americans that America first is the best option. And Viktor Orbán is saying Hungary is unique, specific, and Hungary first. And I think that we have fundamental problem now how to maintain this family. What Phil Ricker was emphasizing that in family we can have differences, but we need to speak about them. But there are few core issues which should be unquestionable. And for me, as I understood rules of the game when we were changing our countries, that independent judiciary, free media, civil society, and all of this, that this is something what within this family shouldn't be questioned. And national specificities shouldn't jump about these. But if you have countries and situations in various periods of time in any family member where this is overdone, I think we need to speak about that openly and freely. Otherwise, family will not hold together. This is not that each of us is different, unique, and so on. This is non-brainer. But I think that if it is overdone, we are risking that we will dissipate. And I do not buy argument that Russia and China are enemies or threat, and this is the primary thing why we need to do whatever to defend, because unless we will be open, clear within ourselves, in our family, I think that those whom we view opponents, and they are opponents, they will have easier job with us.
Thank you. I think some really important points there. Another vote for universal values. And maybe a bit on Dan's point that not all of us are living our best selves right now. With that, I'd love to go to your questions. So I assume you have some. Please. Let's go here.
Hello, Ian King, CSAS. Extremely valid points and very interesting points made. Accepting the view, and I think most people here would accept it, that we have a confrontation at the values for which the West stands, and that we have a narrative battle going on where Russia and China in particular are fighting a strong fight. The West is in some ways ill-prepared to defend itself because our traditional tools of defense are institutions which are not geared up to fight metaphysical battles to defend values or to construct narratives, because they're generally values-free and they're instrumental and they follow orders. So how do we reconfigure ourselves so that our tools of defense can defend effectively against the attacks and the onslaughts from Russia and China?
Well, I want to push back on the notion that we don't know how to defend our values. Sure we do. How do you think we won the Cold War? It wasn't through a military confrontation. It was precisely through the battle of ideas and a powerful combination of, if I may say so, national specificity combined with universality. Okay? The national specificity in Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, both halves of Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, Poland, and the Baltic states drove people. But the conclusion they came to was, we can realize our national destiny best if we adhere to universal values. I mean, they worked it out. You know, don't ask me, I mean, read that stuff. You know, from, you know, Leszek Kołakowski, or Bronisław Geremek, or Adam Michnik, or a lot of the conservative thinkers in the Catholic intellectual groups in Poland. So we do know how to do this quite well, actually. We've gotten out of the habit, which is not the same as not knowing, which is why you have a terrible old man such as myself speaking in these terms to, you know, people a generate, you know, 40 years younger, because we do know how to do this if we recall. And to make the point, in defense of the Hungarian tradition, what I'm talking about, you know, the Hungarian national uprising in 1848 was made in the name of those universal values and the Hungarian nation. And you had the Hungarian forces were led by a Polish general in a sense of solidarity, and they were, by the way, fighting the Tsar. So, like, we haven't forgotten, you know, and that is the answer to the question of national specificity. Because every nation has its specific tradition which fits in this universal model.
Although, if I can follow up,
yeah.
Because you said we had the muscle memory, we just stopped doing it. Well, there's a cohort of Americans here, the millennial generation, who actually don't know enough. And the fact that Western civilization has ceased to be, as a course, has ceased to exist in most college curricula, the fact that American history and European history is not taught enough, the fact that 1/3 of the millennial generation thinks that George W. Bush killed more people than Stalin, that's a bad picture. There is a lot of homework to be done there. And what it really comes down to is teaching our shared history. What are the achievements of Western civilization? What are the shared historical heritage and treasures that we really need to defend here? And that's what RT ridicules. That's what the Chinese can easily come in and say, well, we have our 5,000 years of history, and why don't we just put an equation mark there when you're talking to an actual communist party. And you know, when it comes to the crimes of communism, when it comes to the specific history of communism, that needs to be taught in a way that is actually showing the United States' role as key, integral, and victorious in a sense. Mm-hmm. But we need to stop talking about the fall of communism in 1989 globally, when the largest country in the world is still a single-party communist dictatorship. And when we gloss over that fact, then of course millennials are confused. And so we need to get our definitions right. We need to get some metaphysical truths right, because without that, we can pour all the money we want to in RFE/RL, but we will not be able to win the intellectual battles.
Hi, Susan Ford from German Marshall Fund and the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Thank you for the very frank comments today. And Ambassador Fried, I think I will use your sovereignty limited by higher values as the most succinct description I've heard. Having read the report, which is in many ways excellent, I did have some concerns that as we're talking about, and pretty clear in the analysis today on concerns on democratic deterioration in Hungary and Poland, the report itself is very gentle on Hungary and Poland. I'm wondering if there was an editorial decision on that, and you know, as we're talking about having national specificity. So if we're talking about concerns and being able within a family to talk about those concerns, but that enables us to get to kind of better recommendations, solutions, and defensive values. So I'd appreciate any comment on that. Thank you.
So I'm one of the authors of that report, and I worked hard on that section. so I owe you an answer to a perfectly reasonable question. I said in the beginning, I thought some of the criticism coming from the West was less informed and lazy. But if you actually read the report, it makes clear that the foundation of U.S. Central European relations is values. And without those common values, it is hollowed out. Moreover, without those common values, there's no counterweight to the American inclination to go to spheres of influence and cut dirty deals. Yeah, that has a bad history when we start to do that. So I would say that it is not, we wanted to avoid hectoring, but I don't think we pulled punches. We just recognized that all of the West is going through these issues. It was interesting. In Christendom, and I'm talking about medieval Christian philosophy, the notion was prevalent that the king needs to be limited. And what limits the king is strong institutions. Now, then it was the church. Now it's a free press and independent institutions. And without those, yesterday the question came up, how do we convince people that, I think Ambassador, you mentioned it, how do we speak to people about why democracy matters for them? And the answer is, without strong independent institutions, you get tyranny. And tyranny means telephone justice and a state which is basically Putin-esque, a mafia state where the person running the country runs everything. That's all in the report. It isn't put quite that dramatically, but it's there, and that's the argument. Ambassador, I took your challenge seriously. You know, you said Western civilization ought to be taught. I could not agree more. I mean, the notion of tyranny sounds old-fashioned, right? The tyrant is the king not constrained by law. King George III, right? And that's the message. And that's core to the report. I just was tired of the kind of impatient finger wagging and then thinking we would be able to freeze out the Hungarians, not talk to them at all, and expect good results. Like, what, seriously? We have to be present, we have to be principled, we have to be persistent, but, you know, have some respect for the societies which have liberated themselves. Now, the elections happen. Let's not simply project a straight line into the future. Anyway, that's, I thought there'd be a question like that, so that's my best shot at an answer. But the work, look, the paper's going to have to stand by itself and take whatever hits people give it.
Pavol.
I think that Dan was afraid that 4 foreign ministers wouldn't come to speak after our panel. This was primary reason, because you will have chance to ask questions foreign ministers, and you will see, you know, what kind of differences they may have on these outstanding issues. But there is one remarkable phenomenon going on within Visegrad 4 nowadays. People are saying, okay, is this still valid, this quartet? Because there are differences in state of democracy or attitudes towards the West and so on. I think that in spite of all ups and downs within Visegrad 4, it's remarkable how we are holding together, even if this is informal institution or grouping, that in this vulnerable time within European Union and the search for purpose within whole Western family, I think it puts us somehow together, and we are closing sometimes eye not to over-criticize, not to do too much to sort of create frictions within the 4, because there is one interesting thing where Visegrad vis-a-vis Western Balkans, if you would travel there now, many people see there that we are more helpful and more understanding what's going on than many Western countries. You know, watching France and Netherlands, whether they will recognize or not Northern Macedonia or open up debate on membership and all kinds of bizarre things. So Visegrad 4 are not only dealing with their domestic things, but now we view ourselves as actor within the region when it comes to Balkans or Ukraine or Eastern Partnership countries. So I think that even if we are seeing all kinds of differences among ourselves and uncertainties, how we fit within broader European space, I think we still go on, and I'm sure that when ministers come, you will not see too much disagreement on many issues. What some of us who would like to see more freedom, democracy, and all of these issues, that foreign ministers found a way of balancing some differences in the name of bigger game, what is keeping European Union in these turbulent, globally turbulent times together.
Right here.
Thank you. My name is Zsófia Rácz. I'm from Hungary. I work there at a think tank called Center for Fundamental Rights. Mr. Fried, I really liked the way how you highlighted the difference at the very beginning of your speech between nationalism and chauvinism. However, what I see from a Hungarian point of view is that the confusion is most obviously between the words nationalism and imperialism when it comes to Hungary. And many people still say that the cause of the world wars was nationalism. However, I think it was rather imperialism. But I would be interested in your opinion if you could elaborate between what's the difference between the two.
Well, I don't want to get into a definitional political science discussion. There's no such thing as political science. If it were science, we'd try it on animals first. Okay? No. The cause of the war, of World War II, was that the Americans pulled out of Europe, leaving it to Mr. Hitler and Mr. Stalin. What did we expect was going to happen? Now, what was Hungary supposed to do, or Poland? They had impossible choices to make. The Poles fought, they lost. The Hungarians made the best of it, didn't turn out well for them either. Impossible choices. Which is why I can't stand America First. In its original incarnation, I don't think much of the current one, for that reason. Getting that balance between patriotism, which is a love of one's country, and respect for the universal values, without which, who are we? What are we? That's hard. We don't have it right in this country, as the, let us say, domestic political discussion this past week has demonstrated. So we're in a bad position to lecture anybody else from a superior position. We're all in the same boat here. We're just doing various iterations of the problem. And that kind of modesty should inform modesty about our place to wag our finger. I'm speaking as an American. But confidence that the higher angels and our best values will save us yet. Finding that is not easy, but it's possible.
Back on that one. I think that a foreign policy of realism, restraint, and respect is something that a lot of us can sign up for. And what you're referring to as America First is, I believe, a reaction to an overreach of too many military adventures abroad that those who were actually fighting got tired of. It does, in Hungary at least, it doesn't get misinterpreted. The foreign minister says all the time, "Good for you, America first for you, Hungary first for us," and that's just commonsensical. I think that most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, including Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, Czechia and Hungary, there's a good gut instinct of common sense a healthy trust in certain Western institutions, but also a healthy distrust of government controlling everything, which we have had for too long. And a healthy aspiration to be part of Europe that we always belong to. When it comes to Hungary, over 1,000 years, it was a geopolitical decision made by St. Stephen in 1000. We're not going to be Eastern Orthodox, we're going to be belonging to the West. That's something that was decided then. People tried to change the borders, hordes invaded us, and we still resisted. And that's a decision that we made then, and we made when we joined the European Union, when we joined NATO, which, by the way, in Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic enjoys very high support. Hungary, when you look at the 18 to 35 generation or cohort, NATO has above 80% support in Hungary, which is great. Because military is hard to sell in any country where the military played a weird role for a period of time. When the military was knocking on your door, it was never a good sign. So the fact that there is a commonsensical shared identity with the alliance that we're all talking about here, represented by NATO, is a very good sign. That's something that the GLOBSEC report came out and showed beautifully. And I think everybody who is interested in the subject, I would highly recommend that. Came out in March, I believe.
I would just like to add that what we really need more now is looking at public's sentiments, public attitudes, which are shifting very much. In era of internet, social media, I think very often groups like these are like-minded, but very often our attitudes, evaluations doesn't match too much what's going on. And with this GLOBSEC report, what made headlines in Slovak media was that America is viewed as bigger threat than Russia. But then, as Matt raised yesterday when we had this, what threat means? Because somehow US is misunderstood or not understood well enough, and all our tools of public diplomacy need to be brushed up. I think that we are losing very much, not only as you, Anna, in your introductory remarks mentioned, we need to invest more, we need to think more about how to work with publics. I think that this is fundamentally important because we never had this period when public became part of foreign policy and diplomacy as what we have now. 30 years ago it was foreign policy and all of this was rather elite area of interest. Nowadays, during hybrid warfare techniques, you could use and misuse online space to get your version or your narrative much easier than what official narrative is all about. And so doing more research focused on public attitude and changes of public attitude is, I think, critically important. And I would also highlight this partnership between Atlantic Council and GLOBSEC and other think tanks within United States. More partnership among us, sharing, pooling resources, both financial, human, intellectual, the better. I think that if you look at how many institutions we have, both public, private, but we have very little synergy among them. These are very often parallelly run institutional efforts, grant for here, grant for there, you are doing next project, but very often people do not know about each other efforts. And I would strongly suggest that these joint ventures between United States, Central European, other European institutions should significantly increase. I would almost put as a condition that if you want to do something vis-a-vis Central Europe, that you need to show with whom you cooperate on that, because it shouldn't be just and I like, and I didn't know that in Budapest they have common sense think tank, which I need to learn about, because having common sense think tank in Budapest, it sounds very promising, and I would like to cooperate with you.
By the way, I think the best way to shape the narrative about America and about the West is to show up. And you talk a lot about that. You can't expect people in Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe, to be in love with America for a long period of time without showing up for a long period of time. And we were just talking about this. The President Bush visit was the last, as far as I remember, the last presidential visit by the United States, and that happened at the previous anniversary of 1956, almost 13 years ago. And we went 13 years without the U.S. president showing up. That's just, from my perspective, that's just not good policy. So when people ask or criticize or even question whether Trump should have met Prime Minister Orban and when and how, I don't think the question is should he have met Prime Minister Orban, is how soon can the new president-elect meet every prime minister of every NATO ally countries, and when is the next meeting? And how often do they go to the region? So I think there's no substitute for presence. And that's the absolute best way to shape the narrative. And we've had a plethora of congressional delegations in Budapest. Very good that they have FaceTime with our leaders. As the ambassadors know, that's probably the best way to shape their understanding of the countries, to have them physically be there, have them taken out to great dinners at Halászbástya and all of the other landmarks in Central and Eastern Europe. And that really shouldn't, that's a non-starter, I think.
Great. So we have 5 minutes left. I'd love to take, if there are a couple of questions, happy to take those and then give our panelists about a minute each to respond. So I'll start here and just ask you to make your questions a sentence or two.
Ross Johnson from the Wilson Center. Good comments on sovereignty and universal values. I think I'm missing one thing. The ambassador last night referred to the fact that the Central European countries were dealing with surrendered a certain amount of sovereignty to the European Union. And so the question would be, particularly for Poland and Hungary, perhaps other Central European countries today, is that a stable future relationship? Or are there now real concerns that what was agreed to and concluded, partial surrender of sovereignty, was a mistake, and that this has got to be revised? Because if it's stable, if it goes forward, then the United States needs to be dealing with the EU on these issues and not just individually with the individual Central and East European countries.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Alex Palmer from the National Democratic Institute. I'm curious to know, in response actually to Ambassador Korczyk's comment yesterday regarding the need to connect democratic norms and values to tangible things that impact citizens in their day-to-day lives. NDI conducted research with young people last year that found that, yes, they support democracy as an institution overwhelmingly, but they're willing to sacrifice certain principles within the sphere of democratic values to support greater economic and security concerns. And so I'm curious to know, from a messaging and communication standpoint, does the panel have any recommendations for how to approach this support for democratic norms and values in a way that connects specifically with the priorities of citizens in their day-to-day lives, including young people?
Great, thanks. So I will give our panelists each about a minute. Why don't I start with you, Pavol?
I think that this is fundamental question what we will be struggling with, people like us, think tanks, diplomats. Vocabulary matters and the messaging matters tremendously. And we have to remind our leaders that what they say needs to be facts-based, a little bit less politics, and listen a little bit more to diplomats. I think that we see in this period that diplomacy became like servant to politics in most countries, including this one. And if we want to do messaging and connecting policies with approaches towards broader public, it must be clear, understandable, and there must be credibility behind what we are telling and how we are acting. So it's simple like that. We will not be able to come out with some magic PR formulas to get publics on our side until there is these sort of elements of truth and clarity in what we do. And you can be politician or analyst or diplomat. This is for me the basis. And then you need to be just brave and fight for that. I don't buy this shrinking space for civil society everywhere. I think we have just changed landscape, and 30 years after, we need to reclaim our commitment to those basic values which I was addressing in my first intervention. And then we are just fine, and we don't need to just speak about lack of self-confidence. We should become more confident, brave enough to address challenges which are faced from within transatlantic community and vis-a-vis others who are trying to undermine it.
So I'm glad the EU question was asked, because I've read several polls recently. GLOBSEC also has done similar research on this, and asked throughout Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the EU 28, research done by the Sazovic Foundation, and asked the question, would you like to stay in the EU or leave? Hungary came in, when you look at the EU 28, Hungary came in the third most wanting to stay, way above the EU average. So this debate is not about, and GLOBSEC showed the same actually when it came to generational breakdown. The youngest people were the most pro-EU and stay in the EU, and as it fluctuates over generations, the older generation tended to be a little less so, but still above 72 or 73%. So this is not about whether we want to leave the EU or not. Absolutely not. What this is about is that the EU itself needs to be comfortable with the idea that the Brussels cosmopolitan professional bureaucrats are not the only ones driving the EU's political agenda. That it's French farmers in the Massif Central, it's the fishermen in North Devon, it's the blue-collar workers and auto workers in Kecskemét, and the same thing with Michigan truck drivers in the United States. That needs to have an effect on how the EU operates, and this is a healthy debate, actually. I think about the institutions of the EU. It should strengthen the institutions of the EU. You will never hear a Hungarian foreign minister talk about wanting to leave the EU. It's always a debate about where are those specific lines of policy where we're still comfortable with ceding our sovereignty. That is completely understood by what we signed up for.
Well, we're about out of time, but Dan, do you want one word quickly?
I think sovereignty, it's important for the EU and the new member states who have just regained their sovereignty to figure out ways to work together. There are more complicated issues. Sovereignty and respect for all the groups that Anna just mentioned doesn't also mean that independent judiciary and media gets to be dominated by the state or the government. These issues have to be worked out, but they have to be worked out in a way that is sensitive to the concerns about sovereignty for peoples who didn't have them. And then with respect to values and everyday life, I made a stab at that argument. And I also agree completely with Anna Smith-Lacey about teaching civics and the fundamentals of Western values, and including the Enlightenment and limited sovereignty limited by common values, and the danger of tyranny. That stuff is good stuff, and it should be taught without either the right's distortion and forgetting of the Western tradition or the left's kind of sneering mockery. I don't like either one, but there's plenty of room in between.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our hosts here at the Atlantic Council and our great panelists.